look at me the entire time.
Oh, look at you the entire time?
Yes.
Okay. All right. My name is Sharron Strictland White, and that's Sharon spelled with two R's, S-H-A-R-R-O-N. I'm a native Atlantan. I claim to be. My mom migrated to Atlanta when I was an infant. And of course, I was born in 1942, July 27th, so I'll be 73 years old this month. And what I'm about to talk about happened 50 years ago. So I'm glad to be sitting in this chair and able to recollect some of the things that really invoke some powerful feelings. Because I lived on the right side of history with the kinds of things that happened during the student movement in Atlanta. As a small child, I remember segregation because my father worked for the L&N Railroad, and we had to go to the Union Station to see him off. When we got to the Union Station to see him off, they had signs. One said colored and one said white. So I ran over there and I got some water from the white water fountain, and then I ran over there and I got some water from the colored water fountain, and I said, this water is not colored, because I could read. I was expecting it to come up like punch. Segregation was something that we were protected from. Back then we were colored. I was a little colored girl in Atlanta. My uncle Willard Strickland was one of the original 8 cops that served Atlanta. They could not arrest white people. They had to hold the perpetrator and wait for a white policeman to come and arrest the perpetrator. Chief Jenkins was the police chief back then, and he did not allow the colored cops in the same precinct with the white cops, so they had to change their uniforms and use the office at the Butler Street YMCA that runs on Butler Street, that ran perpendicular to Auburn Avenue back in the day. My childhood was a happy time, however, because the culture was self-contained. That was the time when Auburn Avenue was bustling with black businesses, and we were self-sufficient and independent within our culture. So we had access to every need provided by blacks, whether it be your doctor, your dentist, your attorney, your everything that we needed was provided within the black community. Also, the church was an integral part of our culture. So we spent many a day at our churches, whether they be Baptist or Methodist or whatever. The denomination didn't matter. But that's where we took care of each other during this particular period of time. Well, I was in high school from 1955 to 1960. I graduated high school in 1960. During that time, Ivan Allen was running for mayor. So he hired us to campaign for him, and he paid us $25 a week, which was a lot of money back then, to put flyers out. And we did that. And of course, at that time, I didn't realize he was responsible for putting up the buffer zone right there at Peyton Road, and was instrumental in discouraging blacks to move past that line. And of course, that was during the time when housing was segregated too. Brown versus Board of Education. Segregation with the separate but equal doctrine didn't work because it was not really equal. I mean, it was separate, but it wasn't equal. When we were at Washington High School, we were given the secondhand books from Roosevelt High School, and it had Roosevelt High School stamped in the books. But at that time, because of the fact that there was segregation, we had some of the brightest minds teaching us at Washington High School. These were people who were trained in the discipline, The curriculum was so astute until we were taking Russian, we were taking physics, we were taking Latin. We took all of the courses that provided us with an attitude, concepts, and skills necessary to perform competently in a segregated society. I think as a result of finishing Washington High School, then I did go to Morris Brown College. And it was there that I started to work for the Atlanta Inquirer. Lottie Watkins, and I haven't heard her name mentioned much, but she was quite a businesswoman in Atlanta and worked for Herman Russell, who was building apartments where we were colored back then, where colored folks could live, because at that time there was no housing, even for young couples. You either had to room in with somebody in order to just have your basic need of housing met. Well, as a result of working for Lottie Watkins, I was her girl Friday. I used to take her money to the bank, and I would have $2,000 in my drawer. I never got robbed. The office was right there on what we call Hunter Street, but it's now Martin Luther King. And on a given day, she introduced me to Mr. Jesse Hill, who was at that time president of Atlanta Life Insurance Company. But the Atlanta Inquirer was born, and they hired me as a reporter for the Atlanta Inquirer. And at that time, Julian Bond, Charles Black worked for the paper. Irene Ireland was our secretary at that time. Mr. Billups was in charge of advertising, and advertising drove the paper. That was during the time of the old-fashioned linotype machine, so you really had to meet the deadlines, and that was the part that I didn't like, because on one given occasion, Mr. Hill came in and he said, "Miss Strickland, do you have that copy ready? Do you have it ready?" And I said, "No, sir, I'm working on it." And he just raked everything off my desk, and he said, "Look, with a newspaper, you have deadlines. If you don't meet the deadline, you're dead," and raked everything off my desk. Well, Julian Bond came in and he rescued me. And he said, "Don't worry about it." He used to call me Brenda Starr. He said, "Don't worry about it, Brenda Starr." He said, "We'll get it together." And we covered the news of what was going on, what with the movement. And on one occasion, we went downtown to cover the police blotter. And so Bond said, "Well, Sharon, let's take the back stairs because we might encounter a police brutality case." And on that day, we didn't, but we covered the police blotter, and we covered the activities that were going on with the movement. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was a collective effort of the entire Atlanta University Center. So that included Morehouse, where Julian Bond was, and Charles Black. Then, of course, you had, besides Morehouse, you did have Spelman with Ruby Doris Smith. And then you had Clark with Carolyn Long Banks and Ben Brown. And then I was at Morris Brown with William Hickson. They would leave and come around the campus all the way to West Hunter Baptist Church. That's the little rock church that's right there on Martin Luther King now, but of course then it was Hunter Street. And it was there in the meetings. And Julian Bond conducted those meetings, helped to conduct those meetings, and we were told over and over to exercise passive resistance. Passive resistance. That was the buzz. Passive resistance. And we had two groups. We had the arrest group, and we had the hit and run group. Now, I was in the hit and run group. And I'll explain to you why I was in the hit and run group. At that time, Frank Cunningham was the president of Morris Brown College, and then we had Dr. Manley, I think, who was the president over Spelman. But even the classes and the ongoing academic world, academia was sensitive to what was going on, but they still didn't make any provisions for it. which meant that if you were out of class during the time there was a final exam, it would affect your grade. When I was at Morris Brown, I was on full scholarship as long as I maintained a B average, and I never missed the dean's list. I made the dean's list every time. Then I could maintain my scholarship. And there was no money for college. And so I knew how important it was for me to maintain that scholarship. So that's why I was in the hit and run group. All right. On a given day, and it was cold that day that we decided to go and picket. We picketed Davison's, which is now Macy's now, on Peachtree Street. And across the street was Woolworth's. When I was picketing, a woman honked and expectorated on me. So I had to just keep walking with my sign. We would walk around and around. And then the woman in front of me, well, actually we were students then, somebody just ripped up her sign. But in the meetings, they said, passive resistance. So we were not to react. We were to be non-violent. So we continued to picket. And then, of course, they called the police. And when they called the police, then that's when the arrest group got arrested. And that's when those of us who were in the hit and run group were not arrested. At that time, Louise Hollowell was teaching at Morris Brown College. She was my major professor, and she was the wife of Donald Hollowell, who was the attorney that bailed everybody out. I'm so glad that the ones who were in the arrest group made the sacrifice. I remember Carolyn Long Banks and Julian Bond, because they made the ultimate sacrifice because it affected their whole academic prowess. They were not able to be in class for the final exams. And so, therefore, their schooling was interrupted. They made that sacrifice. I think that the buzz back then came with the backdrop of the Berlin crisis that was going on. Ralph McGill was the editor-in-chief of the Atlanta Journal and Constitution, and back then we had two newspapers, the morning paper and the evening paper. But the Atlanta Inquirer really was the one that decided to really recognize the pulse of the public and really tell actively what was going on with the movement. I think as a result of the efforts of SNCC, that it was like a gigantic nucleus that permeated the community. And it was decided that we would imitate what was going on in Alabama in terms of the buses. We didn't have any problem with desegregating the buses because we all lived in a segregated society of Atlanta, and the 3 West Hunter bus had nobody on there but black people, so you could just sit anywhere on the bus. But at that time, we decided not to ride the buses, period, and they provided what we called jitneys. And even the people who worked as maids didn't even ride the buses. Some of the cabs and some of the people who owned automobiles would pick up the maids and take them to Buckhead to work in those domestic kinds of positions. When I think back on it now, I'm just glad that I had an opportunity to participate in the movement, and that's what it was. It was definitely a movement, and we can tell that there has been a change. And what's remarkable to me, though, is for us to come up as students with that Bill for Human Rights, because all of the issues that we put forth back then as students are the same issues that we have now for jobs and for education and for the right to vote. They had the Junior Voters League involving the high school students who went out to help in terms of encouraging people to get out to vote. Hosea Williams' name is not mentioned very much, but he is a Morris Brown person and was truly an academic person too, because he was an expert when it came to chemistry. But he's been described too as a rabble-rouser, because he would really meet head-on people who were trying to enforce segregation. So that's about the story as I remember it. I can see the growth. I lived in the Cascade area after becoming an adult. And of course, I witnessed the white flight. I lived on Anna Lane, right off of Benjamin E. Mays Drive, which was Sewell Road at that time when we moved there, and they renamed it for Benjamin E. Mays, who lived on Pamlico in the neighborhood. But I do remember how the street was white in terms of residences, and then the ball players who all of a sudden had money, and money is green, and Brown and Reese, the realtors, decided to sell those houses, and so whites moved out and blacks moved in. Only a smidgen of the whites remained. So at that time we had Frank Pitts that played with the Kansas City Chiefs. He went to the Super Bowl twice. They lived across the street. And then Hank Aaron lived on Linfield before he moved to Adams Drive, where he lives now, when he lived with his first wife on Linfield. Well, all of the ball players were making lots of money, and so they bought those houses. I think we moved in there back in 1968 when the mortgages were like $35,000. And I remember Diane Pitts said, "Sharon, we're going to pay off our mortgage." And I thought, pay off the mortgage? We're in this for 30 years. But anyway, the diversity is a good thing, because now, even at 72 years old, I live in Cobb County. And true, I do see a few of the Confederate flags sporadically around, but the community where I live now at the Highlands of West Village, there's such diversity, and the living is easy.